Welcome back, fifth graders. Last week we finished reading. We're writing the Constitution. This week, for a final activity, you're going to do a scavenger hunt. You are going to be looking for the men that said certain quotes and for the certain things that they did during the Constitutional Convention. There are 12 men, and there are 16 quotes and activities you need to find that go with each delegate. So what I'm going to do this week is to reread the pages that you will need in order to find the answers. And sometimes I'm only going to read a paragraph from the page, but the answer will be right in the paragraph I'm reading to you. And I will let you know what pages I'm reading on. If you bring up the Google Doc first and read it over, that will be very helpful, because then you'll know what types of quotes and activities you're looking for. Okay, so let's begin. The first pages I'm going to read are parts from pages 9 and 10. There are two answers that you will need on pages 9 and 10. Okay, by 1786, it was becoming obvious that changes were needed. People were in debt. A few states were printing paper money that was all but worthless. And in the midst of this disorder, some people could see that America would fall apart if it didn't have a sound central government with power to act for all the states. George Washington, of course, was one who had felt strongly about this for a long time. Alexander Hamilton was another. Born and brought up in the Caribbean islands, he had no patience with the idea of state loyalty. America was nothing but a monster with 13 heads, he said. James Madison from Virginia wanted a strong America too. He was a little man, described as being no bigger than half a piece of soap, but he had big ideas for his country. Okay, the next paragraph is on page 10. Rhode Island refused to have anything to do with the convention. Patrick Henry, when asked to be a delegate from Virginia, said he smelt a rat and wouldn't go. Willie Jones of North Carolina didn't say what he smelled, but he wouldn't go either. Okay, the next page I'm reading from is page 12, where you will find one answer. In all, there would be 55 delegates. Although coming and going as they did, there were seldom more than 30 there at the same time. The first thing the delegates did was to elect George Washington president of the convention. They escorted him to his official chair on a raised platform. Then the other members of the convention took their seats at tables draped with green woolen cloth. James Madison sat in the front of the room, and as soon as the talking began, he began writing, never absent for a single day. He kept a record of that all that was going on during the next 4 months, stopping only when he himself wanted to speak. Page 13, you'll find one answer. They knew that there would be many arguments in this room, but they agreed that they didn't want the whole country listening in and taking sides. They would keep the proceedings a secret. So before every meeting, the door was locked. Sentries were stationed in the hall, and even though it turned out to be a hot summer, the windows were kept closed. Why should they risk eavesdroppers? Members were not supposed to write gossipy letters home, nor to answer nosy questions, nor to discuss their business with outsiders. Benjamin Franklin was the one who had to be watched. He meant no harm, but he loved to talk, especially at parties. So if he seemed about to spill the beans, another delegate was ready to leap into the conversation and change the subject. Okay, our next page will be page 20. And it has one answer on it also. After a day's recess on June 15, William Patterson of New Jersey stood up. Only 5'2", He wasn't as impressive a figure as Mr. Randolph, but he was a cheerful, modest, likable man. Still, he didn't approve of a single idea of Mr. Randolph's. The government should be a federation of states as it was now, with each state having an equal vote, he said. It should consist of one legislative body with several executives at its head. According to Mr. Patterson, the Virginia plan was impractical, illegal, and expensive. How could so many members of Congress, he asked, find the money to travel from all over the country to attend meetings? Our next page I'll be reading to you is page 26. It has 2 answers on it. It couldn't have been any fun to sit all day in a stuffy room, arguing and then being insulted as soon as they stepped out for a breath of fresh air. On the other hand, the delegates may have had too much on their minds to pay attention. Certainly they suffered in many ways, and it was a wonder they didn't quit. Some did. 2 delegates from New York, who didn't like the way the convention was going, went home. But most knew that they were deciding the future of their country, one which would be larger and different from anything they could imagine now. Sometimes when a delegate worried that the people wouldn't like this or the people wouldn't like that, James Madison became impatient. Who knew what the people would like, he asked. Their job was to make the best possible government, not simply to please the people. And all the time George Washington sat in the front of them, his expression stern as if he were saying, now or never. It'd be hard to walk out on Washington. Our next page is page 32. There will be 1 answer on page 32. How about letting foreigners be members of Congress? Governor Morris, called the tall boy of the convention, pointed out that if it took 7 years to learn how to be a shoemaker, a foreigner ought to spend 14 years to learn how to be an American legislator. In the end, a senator was required to be a citizen for 9 years, a representative 7 years, and the chief executive or president had to be native born. The next page is page 34, and it will have 1 answer on it. Madison sighed. There was no need for a Bill of Rights, he said. It was taken for granted that individuals kept all the rights that they didn't specifically give over to the government. Finally, with some changes, the Constitution was sent out to be engrossed on parchment, an official document for the delegates to sign. When it came back, the delegates looked at it in wonder. After all, this was the first time that a people had written down rules to start a nation off from scratch. On paper, the Constitution looked so real that Washington declared it a little short of a miracle. Still, it was not perfect, Benjamin Franklin pointed out. He disagreed with some parts, but then he wasn't perfect either. None of them were, and he was convinced that this was the best they could do. He hoped the delegates would give their new Constitution a chance. Let them not undo their summer's work, he begged. Next page is page 36, and you will find 2 answers on this page. Those who were for it called themselves Federalists. Those against were called Anti-Federalists, although the antis said they were the true Federalists, and those in favor of the Constitution could be called Nationalists. It took more than 6 months for the states one by one to call their conventions, debate, and vote. Meanwhile, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and another strong Federalist, John Jay, began writing newspaper articles explaining just how the new Constitution would work. On page 37, there will be 1 answer also. They might not expect to make a government absolutely safe from all forms of tyranny, but their object was to create a kind of obstacle game which would keep the government in balance. Indeed, they talked so much of checks and balances that this might describe the kind of game it was. Every bill the House of Representatives passed, for instance, had to go to the Senate for its approval. If it made it through the Senate, then it had to go to the President for his signature. If he did not like the bill, he could veto or refuse to sign it. But the House and the Senate still had another chance. If 2/3 of their members voted for it, then it would pass anyway. A final big check lay in the Supreme Court, which could, in the course of legal proceedings, decide if a law, even a state law, was constitutional or not. There was a whole network of checks. Although the president could appoint ambassadors to other countries, judges to the Supreme Court, and a variety of other officers, the Senate had to approve his choices. Any amendment proposed to the Constitution had to be submitted to the states for their approval. Now, how, the Federalists asked, could tyranny slip through such a well-ordered system? Besides, the people themselves had the controlling power. Every 4 years, they would be electing their president at stated intervals. They would also be electing their representatives to Congress. The arguments of the Federalists were strong and so well written that many people grew used to the idea of becoming a nation. Page 38 has one answer, but not all. Patrick Henry took one look at the first words of the Constitution and saw red. "We the people," he snorted. Since when had they become a single people? He'd known something hadn't smelled right, and here was this fancy document that was, with a single stroke, wiped out their 13 separate identities. Besides, it didn't say one word about those basic rights that they had fought a war over. Page 39 has one answer too. All over the country, people argued about a Bill of Rights. In Connecticut, Noah Webster, educator and compiler of dictionaries, contended that such a bill would be nonsense. How could you list all the rights a person had? He asked. Would you include the right to go fishing in good weather, the right of people to turn over in bed at night? And page 44 has two answers. Two of America's most important statesmen, however, were not in the country during any of the constitutional proceedings. John Adams, who would be our second president, was in England serving as our ambassador. Thomas Jefferson, who would be our third president, was our ambassador to France. When John Adams, just arriving in Boston in 1788, heard the news that the Constitution had been adopted, he wrote to Jefferson. "As we say at sea," he wrote, "huzzah for the new world, and farewell to the old one." And Thomas Jefferson, once he felt satisfied that a Bill of Rights would be included, called the new Constitution unquestionably the wisest ever yet presented to men. And those are all the pages you need to complete your scavenger hunt activity. Good luck!